Hi, welcome back. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Ananat. As of July 1, I will be the Malia Professor of Women in Economics at Barnard College, Columbia University. So I'm new to town and very excited to be here today. Particularly excited to be speaking to two very eminent economists, and the definition of balance in economics is to have a microeconomist and a macroeconomist. And so we've got our bases covered here today. I'm very pleased to introduce Carmen Reinhart. She's professor of economics at the Harvard Kennedy School and has served as senior policy advisor and deputy director at the IMF. And then we also have Betsey Stevenson, who is a professor of public policy at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And she has served as chief economist at the Department of Labor, as well as Senate-confirmed member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So basically, if you wanted to be in micro and in macro, those are the two places you would like to recruit from. So I think we couldn't be better positioned today to be hearing about satisfying work than from these two economists. And I'd like to start out by introducing Dr. Reinhart, who will speak first. Oh no, Betsey will speak first.
Okay.
Are you?
Oh. Okay. I was expecting you to speak
I was too, but.
But the slides have spoken.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for being here today. It's so nice to see such a big crowd of people interested and learning about and thinking about what we can do to make the economy more inclusive for women. So I really enjoyed hearing what Arianna Huffington just had to say, because in some ways, it's a lot of what I want to talk about today is really the granular of why we end up having so much burnout, and that it comes from a society that really hasn't addressed the way families and work has changed over the last 50 years. And by addressing those changes, adapting to more ideal workplace policies, more ideal government policies, we could do a lot to make work more satisfying for people. So with that, what I want to do is connect some of the dots for you by seeing how we got where we are, why the problems have arisen, and what are the kinds of changes that we need, both for success for families, but also to actually be more successful overall in the economy, to have greater productivity growth, to have greater growth overall. So let's take a look at some data. So what I'm going to do is show you a bunch of data, and I'm going to try to pull a string through all of it. So first of all, I'll start with something that I'm sure all of you know, which is that there used to be a big difference between how much men worked in paid work and how much women worked in paid work, an enormous gap that has converged over time. And it's converged for two reasons. It's converged because men work less and women work more. But as a result, we have this huge convergence in the roles that men and women are playing in the labor market. And one of the things that's resulted in more recent years is that women have gone on to get more education. They're getting more education, women are getting more education than men at all levels. So even when we're looking at doctoral degrees, women earned 53% of all doctoral degrees in 2017, compared to just 10% in 1970. So women are really overtaking in education. Now, of course, there are some weak spots. You can see them on there, 23% of doctoral degrees in engineering, mathematics, computer science is low. So we're seeing some weak spots, but overall, we see this convergence. But the one thing I think sometimes people forget is this convergence is a slow process. So today, by the way, I turned 48. And when I was in college, which was a long time ago, the gap between men and women in education was just beginning to close. In my cohort, there was more equality between men and women, but even the women who are just a little bit older than I am, found that men were more likely to get higher education than the women were. So what does that mean? That means when I look around at my peers, the women aren't more educated. When the women older than me look around at their peers, the men are more educated. But it's these 20 and 30-somethings coming up where all the skill is lying in the women. So obviously I overstate when I say all, but disproportionately more of the skill is lying in the women. And we're going to have to change how we think about the economy if we want to use the skills we've invested in. We need those women to have equal access to succeed because we've been doing a heck of a lot of investing in them over the first 30 years of their lives. So it's a stock flow issue that I think a lot of people kind of miss. The other thing that's happened during this process is that most of the wage gains have gone to people with more education. So thank goodness women have been getting more education because it's been a big driver of closing the gender wage gap. In fact, if we take a look back in 1979, roughly a quarter of the gender wage gap was simply explained by the fact that women didn't get the education men got and they didn't have the work experience men had. That has really narrowed, and today for younger women, education goes the other way, right? They should be earning more than men because of their more education, and the experience gap has completely evaporated. So the gender wage gap is no longer about any differences in education or experience. So where might some of it be coming from? There's still some really significant occupational segregation going on. And that occupational segregation has partially at its core a failure for some occupations to adapt to a world in which people are trying to balance work and family. So only 29% of the workers in the 20 highest paid occupations are women. So now where's that gender wage gap coming from? That's where it's coming from. 56% of workers in the 20 lowest paid occupations are women. A minimum wage increase matters more for women than men because more women work for minimum wage than men. This still, even though we might complain that women still have a gender wage gap, there's something really important going on that explains a lot of, or some of, the political bizarreness that we see these days, which is that for a long time, men's weekly earnings have stagnated. And through the 80s and 90s, they did okay because their wives propped them up. Wage gains came from women earning more, and so household incomes continued to rise, even though those guys weren't earning anymore. But guess what happened? Women's wages started to stagnate. And so women are no longer propping up household wages in the way that they used to. So we're getting this stagnation. And that's really, I think, ripped the Band-Aid off the deep wound, which is male wage stagnation. But here you can see what's happened. The blue line is women's median weekly earnings going up. The orange line is that men's median weekly earnings. And you can see that the blue line for women's median weekly earnings was doing a better job of keeping up with growth in per capita GDP, while male wages had completely stagnated. So what does this mean? I crunched the numbers, and what you see is that median family income would be $14,000 less today if we hadn't had the gains in women's labor force participation and earnings that we've had since 1970. So if women today were doing what women were doing in 1970, median household earnings would be $14,000 less today. Oh, and by the way, overall GDP would be $2 trillion smaller. So there are big gains that have come, not just for women, but for their families and overall for GDP. So the other thing that has happened is women have started to out-earn their husbands. And this is actually creating some conflict within families. Guys don't always like this. In fact, there's a really nice paper by Marianne Bertrand, which finds that that women basically turn down promotions or raises if all they're going to do is put them just above their husband, right? So if you're hanging out at 49% of household earnings and your husband's got the big half at 51, that's a pretty sweet place to be, and you don't really want to be at 50.5%. So that raise better put you to a big enough amount of money to deal with the crap you're going to get at home when you earn a lot more than your husband. And so there's just this gap we see in the data where women are like, not worth it, not going to do it. But then these census workers showed something that was even more amazing, which is, well, Well, actually, women just lie. They underreport their earnings to census, and they overinflate their husband's earnings to census. So the women are like, I know you're just a census worker, but I don't even tell my sister that I earn more than my husband. I'm certainly not telling you. So we don't really know what's going on in the data. This is the data as reported, and we now know there's a ton of lying going on because it's been matched to some administrative data. When women are earning, I don't mean to just pick on the women who are earning more than their husbands. The real important issue here is that more women are earning something close to half, which means the concept that economists had for a really long time of secondary earners doesn't really apply in the modern economy. So what does an economy with a secondary earner look like? It looks like one where there's somebody that you can call when the kid throws up in class, at noon because they got a stomach bug. Someone's got to come get them. It's easy to know who. It's the secondary earner. Someone's got to stay home because they've got the flu, secondary earner. Someone's got to go to the teacher meeting, secondary earner. Now, what happens when there's no secondary earners? Just two co-equal earners. Who's going to leave work early to pick the kid up from daycare? How are we going to navigate that at home? Whose career is going to come first, and whose boss is going to give us the flexibility for that? These are the kinds of things that families are wrestling with today. So I want to spend a couple minutes just reminding you of how much marriage has changed. And I'd like to show this graph, which shows the percent of people married at each age from every decade from 1880 to 2015. And I do that because I want you to know that 1980 just looked a lot like 1880. So for a long time, we didn't have change. We have this one weird period, which is the green hump, and that's 1960s. That's the 1960 census. So the 1950s, people got married really, really young. That's when everybody was like, whoa, no war, prosperity's here, let's have a baby. I'm only 19 years old. And so that was really unusual behavior. That's not what we saw before. It's not what we saw after it. But then 2000, something looked really different. 2000's that purple line. Look how far below it's sitting all the other lines, including 1980. 1990 was up there. 1990's right on top of 1980. People have been delaying marriage. Now, lots of people complain about this, and they say, oh, look, people in their 30s, they're not married today. Don't be a glass half empty person. Be a glass half full person. It's an excellent time for marriage when you're older. Look at those marriage rates of people in their 70s. They have never been so high. This is the golden age for marriage for people in their 70s and 80s and 90s. I mean, a really great time. Just that's not the time when you have a lot of kids at home. So what is happening is not just about marriage, but then it also changes when we have our babies. So here's this beautiful New York Times graphic where you can see it move to show, nope, we used to have our babies as essentially teenagers or early 20s. Now it's flattening. And there's really an educational gap there where, women with more education, they do not have their kids until their 30s. The median age of first birth for a woman with a professional degree is 34, right? It can't get that much older without some better improvements in technology. So why are women doing that? Well, they're doing that because the research shows that sort of postponing your fertility will help you get ahead in your career, and maybe that will solve some of the problems. Unfortunately, it really doesn't. So what is happening? People want more flexibility. 9 in 10 Americans believe employers should offer workers flexibility to meet their family's needs as long as their work gets done. Over half of workers feel they could do their job better if they were just given a little bit more control, a little bit more flexible schedule. And control is one of the things that makes people more satisfied at work. There's evidence on flexibility. Access to flexible work arrangements has been proven to be highly correlated with greater worker engagement, higher well-being. Companies that adopt new work-life policies, their stock price goes up in the days afterwards. Event studies have shown that. When companies with work-life policies tend to be better managed. Parents believe that they are missing out in the workforce. A third of parents believe they've been passed over for a promotion. Nearly half of parents say that they have chosen to pass up a job that they felt would conflict with family obligations. So they're offered a move. Here, this could improve your career. It'll hurt your family. and 50% are saying, I'm not taking that. I'm sticking with my family. This has implications for how we're allocating workers across the economy. And they're not taking paid parental leave. So for high-wage workers, why aren't they taking paid parental leave? They're not taking it because they say they just have too much darn work to do. They just can't get it done. For low-wage workers, they just don't have any access. So we have a culture that doesn't prioritize paid maternal and paternal leave, paid parental leave. That means a lot of people don't have it, and even those who have it feel a lot of cultural pressure to not take it. It is that 996 mentality that Arianna Huffington was just talking to us about. The thing is, fathers are now more involved parents than ever, and perhaps one of the good, best pieces of news for women is guys are whining more than women about work-life balance right now in surveys. So you ask guys, how's it going? And they're like, this is terrible. I'm working more than ever. I'm like changing diapers and helping with homework and all that stuff my dad never did. And yet they still want me to work as hard at work. So maybe if we can come together and have a bi-gendered partisanship, we can pressure employers to adopt more flexible schedules, more time off when families really need it, so that people can be more engaged with their children. And I think one of the things is culturally, one way we have shifted is all parents spend more time with their kids. It's something they want, and it's something they believe their kids need in terms of investing in their kids for the future. Some of us can't bribe our way into college. We got to do it the old-fashioned way of digging in and putting investments into our kids so that they can get in through our sweat and their sweat. So what's going on? Most workers have no right to paid time off for any reason. I think that's a really important thing. The United States is really alone in that. Most workers have no right to paid time off for any reason. Calling in sick in the United States can get you fired. The FMLA doesn't give you protection for calling in sick. So having a stomach bug can cost you your job. Not all workers are eligible for FMLA job protected unpaid leave. So just really understanding FMLA is great. It's been more than 25 years, and yet it's unpaid, and yet it's still not even extended to all workers. Few low-wage workers have access to any kind of paid parental leave, and so today's families are struggling. What's happening is the state and local governments are enacting policies in the absence of a federal policy. And the one thing I would argue is that, employers are going to start struggling with the fact that they've got different jurisdictional rules to meet if we cannot agree nationally on what some basic, simple, what is an infrastructure that supports satisfying jobs? Do we have paid sick leave? Do we have paid parental leave? What kind of things can we agree on as a wealthy nation that would allow for more satisfying work, because you wouldn't be trying to figure out how to get to work, when you've got a bad case of the flu or your kid has a bad case of the flu. I think one thing I always like to emphasize is the research is really clear in terms of who pays for paid leave, that workers pay for paid time off through lower compensation. So this isn't like a giveaway to workers, and I think it's important to realize that, but the evidence shows that workers want that because it's really stressful to try to balance the potential of losing your job when an illness strikes, or potentially losing half a paycheck when an illness strikes. People like to consumption smooth. It's one of the things economists have shown. And so these policies, even though workers pay for them, it's something that they want. But it's also, there are some big societal benefits. Research shows that mothers have greater attachment to the labor force. Women who take time out of the labor force give them a higher trajectory of wages later on in life. And so you get that greater lifetime earnings. And so the combination of an inflexible labor market, little access to paid leave, and career paths that leave little room for deviation leads that age of first birth to rise, overall fertility to decline, and I think we're really seeing that in people in their 20s right now. It's the first really boom time where we've seen fertility declining. I think that's worth keeping in mind, given the facts I've pointed out today. So to conclude, to support marriage, today's policymakers need to do more to help families reduce the stress of family life, to make more room for the joy And instead of thinking of marriage as the route to financial security, realizing that financial security actually helps support marriages. So I will end there and turn it over to my colleague.
Well, I want to thank Ned for inviting me to this wonderful and much-needed conference. I have a disclaimer to make. I don't do research on gender issues. I don't do research on labor markets, so if I were to talk on my research on gender and labor market issues, my talk would be over right about now. So what I have done is focus on an area that is of keen interest to me, that is very much at the intersection of what we've been talking about, not only Betsey, but also the earlier sessions. And I titled it Some Thoughts on Women and Finance. And really more accurately, I should say some thoughts on women and finance and women in finance, because I am going to touch on those two issues. One is how access to finance, what the state of play is, that is very related to the job market issues that we've discussed today and some of the business issues in the earlier session, but also women within the labor market in various forms of the financial industry. So what are the connection between labor markets, satisfying work, and finance? Well, let me start with, I think what's a pretty important point, is that globally, and the focus of my talk is global, cross-country comparison are alluded to frequently. Participation by women in the formal labor market and financial inclusion are correlated. That's also true for men. As we heard this morning, access to credit is particularly important to small and young firms, and these firms also create a lot of jobs, startups. Women in particular, as I will also allude to and refer to a study, have a particularly, women starting up small and medium businesses have a tough time in access to credit, particularly in what are very bank-centric economies, which is most of the world. Turning to the issue of women in finance, within the labor market, the financial industry, and this is related to one of Betsey's slides where, you know, women have low representation in some of the highest paid jobs. Finance is one of those industries. This is a high earning potential, big compensation, and so to what extent are women reaping this rewards is another point that I will address. And finally, not to leave academia entirely out, academic and research community in the field of finance presumably is doing something to prepare prospective employees for the financial industry. What role are women playing in that field? So as a preamble, let me say that when I use the term financial inclusion, I'm using the very standard definition, and this is access by individuals and businesses to financial products and services that meet their needs. You see whether deposit, loans, and ability to pay bills, to have transfers and the like. I'm relying very heavily on work done by a good friend of mine. She's at the IMF, Ratna Sahai, and her and co-authors have been putting together this really impressive cross-country data on female representation and female financial inclusion. So very quickly, just the sequence of what I'm going to present. I'm going to start out with women as users of finance and talk a little bit about gender gaps and a little bit also about what the studies have shown on the effects of women in finance, as users of finance, and then I'm going to go on to women in the financial industry as private sector, financial sector, and policymakers, and research and academics. That's my trajectory. So as users of finance, here's a global picture. On the vertical axis, you have the share of adult women with a bank account, and in the horizontal, the share of adult males, adult men. And you can see there's 144 countries in the Findex index, and only about 15 countries are along the horizontal line or above it. Most of the observations, as you see, lie to the bottom. So lack of women in having access to finance is a global issue. In terms of magnitudes, this looks at roughly the same data. It's not exactly the same data, but it gives you the same picture, except it's now geographical. The gap globally, that world gap, is about 9%. And what's more disturbing is, since they started gathering this data, the first survey was 2011. The most recent survey is 2017. It hasn't changed. So there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of this and a lot of that, but the gap itself hasn't changed. And of course, it's highly varied in geography. South Asia, Middle East, Central Asia, and emerging Europe are places where the big disparity occurs. And in terms of deposits versus access to deposits versus access to credit, access to credit was something that was alluded to, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of supporting working capital and business formation. On the whole, the two, for the most part, the exception being largely the Middle East to some degree, but for the most part, the two measures typically move together. So what are some general observations from this literature? Well, why do we care about financial inclusion of women? Well, we care about the financial inclusion of women because financial inclusion, up to a point, I will specify, or in the old literature, financial deepening, is associated with higher growth. And by up to a point, I mean is that there's this bell curve, there's this Laffer curve like that, when you're going from low levels of financial inclusion to mid levels of financial inclusion, there's a growth dividend. When you go into very high levels, usually associated with high levels of leverage, and this is more of an advanced economy problem or an advanced economy issue, there's little evidence that beyond a certain point, it adds to growth. But you care about it, these countries care about inclusion because it's presumably carrying with it a growth dividend. In effect, in the Millennium Goals, 60 countries have signed up with targets for financial inclusion and financial inclusion of women as an individual target. The gender gap in financial inclusion is also correlated with income inequality. We've heard this in our discussion earlier today, but the World Bank, for those of you that have any doubt, the World Bank did a study which documents the variety of impediments women and business women and private individuals face in accessing finance throughout the globe. It's also, this is from the Sahai studies, that should be 2015 and 2018. The Sahai studies, extending credit to women is not associated, as far as the studies can show, with any deterioration in credit quality. In other words, the credit quality depends on the quality of supervision rather than the effect of whether the incremental borrowers are men or women. So there's no basis on that to guide a policy of excluding women from credit. Finally, I'd like to highlight that there's a whole literature on sociological and micro studies that find that access by women to finance helps society in general because they spend on, their patterns of spending are supportive of family welfare, and there's actually a literature on fiscal transfers that comes to the similar conclusion. Now, I'm going to turn from the general women as users of finance to women in the financial industry. And first, I will offer my executive summary, which is based on reading what work has been done. And this is actually an optimistic interpretation. There is very little overlap between finance and women. In terms of leadership positions, what this slide does, this is a very careful study, multiple sources. As I said, the IMF is done in the last couple of years, an extensive database on this, looking at the share of women that are board members at commercial banks, board members in supervision agencies, head supervisors, CEO, and I think the numbers speak for themselves. If you look at the breakdown among developing, this is now among developing countries only, in all these charts you'll notice 50%. 50% would imply equality. That's why I leave the decorative line there of 50%. The breakdown is particularly bad for Latin America, the Caribbean, and South Asia, but the gaps are enormous throughout. Before you jump to conclusions and move in the direction of thinking that things are any better for the advanced economies, think again. This chart actually plots on the horizontal line GDP per capita in percentiles. And so the countries with the highest income, that greater than 90%, still only have 13% of women in supervisory agency boards. So you can see why I drew the Venn diagram the way I did. I couldn't resist, given that my work is mostly on issues, or much of it is on financial crises and risk in general, of tackling the question, not personally, but through the studies, of what is the role of women in financial stability. So what are the takeaways of some of this literature? And the literature is thin, but here's the takeaway. 4 points. There is evidence of higher risk aversion in female financial executives. Sahai and others also point out that the prevalence of hiring may prejudice, hiring prejudices may mean that the few women that we do see in the earlier slides that actually make it to the executive level may be more qualified. Diversity in thinking may promote better financial decisions. And finally, there is the issue of selection bias, which the causality may work the other way around. Institutions that attract and select women may be less risky and better in the first place. These 4 bullets are connected to their empirical findings that there is an association between the share of women in bank boards and financial stability. And how do they measure bank stability? They measure it as distance to distress in the midst of the global financial crisis, the share of non-performing loans, and your return on assets. So they use different measures, and this is their big finding. Finally, okay. Among researchers and academics, what this shows is the share of papers by field. Okay, this comes from REPEC, Research Papers in Economics. They report, they have a new page on female representation by field. And the fields are defined by the new economic papers, and there's 93 different fields. And what I've shown here basically is that the average across those 93 fields is 26%. Here are the fields that are above the average. And the ones in pink are finance. And yes, you guessed it, finance is at the very bottom, and only half of the share, half of the average share is accounted for by women, which raises the issue of, you know, is there really a pipeline in education building? So I'm not going to conclude after showing you this on any kind of uplifting note. I think one of the more frustrating and more irksome of these data is that they really are changing, and Betsey mentioned this, they're changing, but they're changing very slowly. My first job was in Wall Street in the early 1980s. And yes, I am sure that it was even more of an issue then, but it's very inertial. And just continuing on that pessimistic note, and I'll stop right here. Look, we in economics, we've had big challenges, not just on dealing with the problems of multiple equilibria, okay? Poverty traps, you know, north-south gaps, chronic gaps, the supposed convergence that we should have seen, you know, years, if not centuries ago, in income levels hasn't happened. So I just hope we have better luck than that. I'll stop.
Thank you both for those great comments. And I'd like to start by connecting some of the things that you both said to the things that Ariana said earlier. In particular, you both highlighted in different ways the extent to which economic growth globally and in the United States at this point really depends on women becoming more and more involved in the formal labor force and in the formal economy. That financial inclusion of women drives economic growth, that women's increased participation within the United States has raised GDP by $2 trillion a year. What we've seen is that we're relying on women to sort of promote, to continue to grow the economy, but at the same time, we haven't seen much reduction in the pressures that they face in the informal economy. And when we think about what Ariana was speaking of about sort of the 996 formal economy and the level of burnout that women are facing, is it sustainable to keep counting on women to keep us from global economic meltdown?
Well, I think what I was trying to say is that the roles of men and women are converging in a way that, I mean, it's not sustainable the way we currently have it. And I think the thing people should be waking up to is what's happening is the current generation in their 20s and early 30s is just deciding to not have kids. So that's one way out. That's one way in which it's not sustainable. And we've seen that in other countries where people are just like, I can't make this all happen, so I'm going to do the career thing. I'm not going to do the kid thing. I think that is, that's a great, for some people that's the right choice, but when you're forced to make that choice because we don't have the right structure in society to support people being able to do both, I think it's a mistake. When you talk about you brought up the idea of how important this is for growth. Look, not everybody needs to be in the workforce. And you may be, home production should count, so people might be very productive at home. But what I worry about is when there's a misallocation of talent. So you could be more productive doing something else, and it would be pretty easy for you to do that other thing if we had some simple infrastructure in place, like a society that lets us take time off when we need it for ourselves or our families, that has more balance between work and family. So there is a trade-off being made with a 996 culture, which is a bunch of people are going to say, I'm not in. I'm not going to participate. And that's going to mean we're going to have them allocated towards something they're a little bit less efficient on. So we're going to be less efficient as a society. The one other thing is, what really is like a primary driver of economic growth? Well, it's innovation. It's coming up with new ideas. If you put a whole big chunk of the society out of that game, then you're going to come up with fewer ideas. Early in my career, one of my research focuses was on Title IX and what it did for sports. And everybody thinks about college sports, but what I showed was what Title IX really did was made mass participation for girls in middle school and high school. We went from 0 girls, essentially 2 to 3% of girls played sports in junior or high school. We went to almost 50%. What did that mean? It means we started winning a ton of Olympic medals. Because when you put all those kids on the playing field, you're going to find who the superstars are. You keep them all off the playing field, you don't know who the superstars are. Well, the same thing's going to be true when it comes to innovation. If they're not thinking, we're pulling people off the playing field so they're not even thinking about ideas, then we're not going to, the person who has the next big idea that really moves things forward isn't getting a chance.
Thanks. So I think that rather than the U.S. right now, I think a great illustration, not that it isn't terribly relevant for the U.S., but I think a great illustration is what's happening in Japan. In terms of, engine of growth, stand and deliver, whatever you want to call it, you have a shrinking population in Japan. In effect, according to IMF estimates, by 2040, it's supposed to shrink by 25%. So the issue of increasing women's participation is urgent. And they've responded to that urgency in ways that were, I hate to use this term, but it's very un-Japanese, in that up to this point, Japan had been very much a laggard in terms of providing things like childcare and the kind of support network that would allow women to be more engaged in the workforce. And necessity is the mother of invention. Well, I think the necessity is hitting advanced economies in varying degrees, and I think we will, therefore, I think some of the things Betsey was talking about, I think will be perhaps even that much more important. I would note that I would have similar expectations for China because Chinese demographics, and this was mentioned this morning, because of the one-child policy, will start aging really dramatically in a couple of decades out. And I think securing women participations, and we're seeing results in Japan, which, as I said, are quite encouraging.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the Japan issue, because what's really interesting there is that their population's shrinking, so they need to get women in the workforce so they have workers. But getting women in the workforce will actually help their population grow, because when you make the way to get women in the workforce is to provide childcare, give paid parental leave, you give those things, and then people are like, oh, I can have kids. So these policies do two things. And what happens when you do not have the things that support working parents is that you end up having low fertility rates as well as lower female labor force participation rates. In other words, our current set of policies around families is lose-lose.
And on that excellent point, I believe that we are out of time, so thank you.